Hi class, hope everybody is doing well. Welcome to a new video tutorial for MMP 350. This week we'll be talking about doing grid design. So we'll take our web app that we've been working on and actually apply some layout principles to it. So in this video you will see a sort of basic lecture on the history of grids and grid design. And then we'll move into the demo section where I'll talk about how to implement a grid layout in your project using CSS Grid, which is probably going to be new for a lot of you guys, but it's a very simple approach to creating a layout. So I think you'll find it interesting. Again, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the Blackboard discussion thread, and I'll take a look there. So I'm going to close this video window and get started. I'll start just by going over some of the basics of what a grid is, and then get into the demo. And as I'll also include links in the YouTube video so you can see where each of those sections starts. This week we're up to week 7, and this is in the class notes. We're going to look at grid systems first, and then do a little demo with CSS Grid. So let's take a look at grid systems. This is going to be sort of a historical overview. I'm just going to go through the notes here. You guys are welcome to read them at home as well. And I'm just going to go over a few examples as a way of introducing some of the terminology that I'll be using when I talk about how to create a layout using a grid in CSS. So this is a little bit of background information. It's not directly related to web design. But it will be useful in terms of understanding what I'm talking about when I go over how to create a grid with CSS. So let's take a look at that. That's under grid systems. I'm just going to turn this into slide view. You guys can view it however you prefer. So let's talk about grid systems. So we're going to look at different ways to create layout. And at first we'll talk about the history of layout and why layout is important. It's related to some of the other topics that we've talked about, like typography and color, where the basic idea is that we want to organize information. So that's an important, So organizing information is kind of the main idea here. We want to make something consistent so the user knows what to expect and what to see each time they open the website, and where to find their login interface versus their posting interface versus just reading other people's posts. So we want to organize all the information on the page. So we'll talk about a brief history. Grids are based on mathematical principles like ratios and proportions. And it's in the Renaissance that we start to see those mathematical principles being applied to visual representation. So you can see this painting here. These lines emanating from the center of the painting represent perspective, which if you've never taken an art class or an art history class, perspective is basically the way that we render on a 2D surface, like a painting or a computer screen, what we see in a 3D world. So in our real life, we see things at a distance, and there are physical principles that determine how, if something is far away, that it looks smaller, and things sort of focus in at this middle point. And so using those principles, we can recreate like a 3D space in a 2D platform, like a painting or a computer screen. So this is kind of where we start to use math to enforce or apply proportions or mathematical principles into 2D visualizations or representations of the world. So one thing that you've probably seen before, if you've ever been in an art lecture at some point, you've probably seen this image, the Apple logo. If we look here, you'll see something that looks like this. Let me see if I can make that bigger. And so you can see the Apple logo for, Apple Computer, and it's based on the rule of the golden principle, the golden ratio, sorry. It's based on the rule of the golden ratio. And the golden ratio is simple, but kind of complex to think about. It's essentially saying that for every unit, so let's say this is like let's say, for this unit here, that's like the width of our website, say if we were doing a website, however big that is. So when we break down that unit into two parts, the sum of those two parts would be equal to the unit they're contained in, and then it goes down and down and down. So then for this smaller unit here, we see the sum of those two parts here. So basically, it's a little confusing, but it's basically just a way of applying sort of a rationale or a system to breaking down a 2D area. And so that's one that a lot of designers will kind of start with when they're trying to come up with what the dimensions for their layout or their design might be. There's no real like hard and fast rule for what ratio or what rules you apply, but having some sort of ratio or having some sort of basic rule allows you to create harmony in the page, because even though we're not aware of it as viewers, we are sort of absorbing these relationships on the page, and it makes it easier to understand what's happening. So here's an example of a sort of book design that applies the golden ratio, but this is in a new dimension. So in this case, we first divide the entire width and height of the book into two parts. And so this would be, page 1, page 2. So we're taking the whole layout and dividing it in half. And then from that half here, we divide another half here, another half here, here, and we keep going until we get to these smaller little margins here. And that's how we decide, the margin for a paragraph versus the margin for maybe the top of the page here, something like that. So that way, the margins around the text of our book can be in relationship with each other. So the manuscript design or book design that is sort of very influential in terms of how web design is done starts actually before there is manual mechanical printing. So this is an example of what's called an illuminated manuscript, which is from the medieval times or the Middle Ages, when mostly monks were transcribing historical texts like the Bible or histories or philosophy texts. And at that time, obviously, they weren't able to reproduce books mechanically. And so they had to have a person actually write out a copy of the book word for word. And so that was the first time when people had to impose design ideas onto information. So one of the things that they use here is this margin right here where they write notes. So our main text is kind of in the middle here, and then we have some drawings around the side. But then there's notes on this right-hand column, so you can kind of see a summary of the text on the right. So you can skim through parts and find something that you want. So this obviously should remind you of a lot of websites that you might see. If I go to for example, ESPN.com, you can see we have our main text or main content in the middle here. And just like we do in the illuminated manuscript, right here is a summary of the rest of the content that you would see on the page. So we can skip to different parts of our content using that summary. So very similar thing, but from probably 500 or 600 or 700 years ago. So that's kind of where that idea was first created. So then with the introduction of the printing press, we're able to create much more standardized layouts for pages. And in this case, you actually see lines depicting the margins on the page. So there's a little gutter in the middle to make it more readable. As we talked about when we covered typography, it's much easier to read a short line like this than to read a line all the way across the page. So to make a book more readable, we can divide a layout into two columns. And with the printing press, that was much easier to do because we had these standardized size pieces that could be placed into the press to create these margins. Another thing you see here is more notes in the margins. So we can skip to different parts of our content. And then you also see here titles. So we'll see that in a lot of websites where you might have a menu or a title at the top of the page before you see the rest of your content. Much later in the early 20th century, industrialization and especially advertising leads to very complex layouts on a printed page. And so now, instead of having your main text and some marginalia, we actually have our main sort of contents page over here, or actually it's just this top part. But then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different advertisements on the page. And so each advertisement is divided up according to how much they actually paid the publication, this magazine, for space. And so they get a certain amount of space and they can design whatever they want. And so the designs start to look very different. And we can divide the space up into much more sections requiring a more complex layout. But there's not as much continuity between the content. And so a lot of designs that kind of looked like this one were not super appealing to the eye. So in the mid 20th century, what's known as the Swiss school or the Swiss style of designers started to really systematize or codify grid layouts. And so you would see very specific grids with the same type of typography and very consistent layouts. And that became sort of the dominant system that you see up until today, both with print design and with web layouts. So that's a bit of the history. We've seen a few examples of grids in printed mediums. And hopefully you can see the connection between those and the websites that we've been looking at throughout the semester. We'll now just take a look at the actual components of a grid, and this will give us some terminology to use when we create our own CSS grids. So let's look at these grid components. So the format describes kind of the available space in a medium. Okay, so if we imagine a magazine or something like that, where maybe it's divided in half right here and you have a page here and a page here, that would be referred to as the format. For a website, the format is everything inside of this browser window. And so the main way that a format is different on the web than it is in print is that it could be any size. I could open up a new window and let's say I want to go to NewYorkTimes.com. Okay, so here's a very large version of the New York Times when I open it up in a very tall and sort of wide browser. But your computer might look like this. And so obviously our websites adapt to a different format, or it might look something like this. Again, we see this kind of adapting to the format. We'll talk about this more in a couple of weeks, but there's also mobile versions of the website. So again, we have to adapt the format. So for us as web designers, the format is constantly changing. And so that's not something that we can kind of expect to be the same. So again, the format is just the available space in a medium. The margins are the space between the content and the outside edge of the medium. So if we had some content in here, this would be our left margin, top margin, right margin, bottom margin. And so margin is pretty useful just to create a little bit of space between the content and the outside of the page. It's pretty consistent across websites. Usually you'll have a little bit of space there. So then units are sort of the base measurement that we use when we're describing the measurements of a grid. So there's a bunch of different units in CSS. We'll talk about a few of them. You guys obviously are familiar with pixels, so we might describe this as being like 600 pixels or something like that. We also have EM, which is, you know, a relative value according to our font. So if our font size was like, let's say 20 pixels, okay, so that would be from the top to the bottom. There's 20 pixels. That would equal 1 EM. So we talked a bunch about that when we were talking about typography. It's also relevant for doing layout because sometimes we'll set the layouts relative to the font size so that it changes, you know, when there's a different font size. So those are some different units that we'll work with, and I'll go over those more as we do the demo. So then as we start to divide up our layout, columns refer to vertical blocks of content on the page. So this is a 4-column layout, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so, you know, a column usually goes from the top to the bottom of whatever section we're talking about. And columns kind of divide the horizontal space of the layout in our web page. Gutters are the space in between columns or rows when we have rows. So in the example up here, there's no gutter at all. So there's 0 space in between each one of these columns. But typically we want to have a little bit of space there just so we can see where one column starts and the next column where one column ends and the next one begins. So this is the gutter here, and we can see there's consistent gutters between these columns. And we can also have gutters between rows, which we'll see in a moment. And then rows, of course, are horizontal blocks of content. So we have a row here, and we have our row gutter here. And rows divide up our vertical space. So we have 1, 2, 3 rows. Okay, so those are some of the basic terminology for the different parts of our grid. And now we can see how when we apply those different things together, we get different types of grids. So we'll go over a few different types of grids. So a manuscript grid is basically just a box with margins. Most books are manuscript grids. You just have your text in the middle and then there's some margin on the outside. Our class website is sort of a manuscript grid right now. If I take a look at that, since we haven't actually applied any layout to our content yet, there is sort of a row layout happening here in our main content, just because we have a bunch of different posts. But the overall layout for our site is essentially a manuscript site. So there's a margin here, there's a margin here, there's a pretty small margin at the top. But then we don't have columns, right? There's no columns. There are rows, but that's just because that's how our content is set up. So we're really looking right now at a basic manuscript grid. So next is a column grid. This is good for laying out information next to each other. So you'll see that in pretty much every website, especially since with a website we're typically scrolling from top to bottom. So a column usually makes a lot more sense in that context because the content can keep going vertically but be separated horizontally. So column grid is pretty typical for a website. This one we see is just a 1, 2, 3 column grid. Very popular one is like what we saw on the ESPN site, where it was 2 columns for the main layout and then 1 column for the menu or sidebar content. So when we're creating a column layout, the gutters are typically going to be more narrow than the margins of the design. So what I mean by that is you can see here that here's a column layout where this is the margin, so the outside, versus the gutter. In this case, it's much larger. And you can see the effect of that is that it really makes this middle column seem much more important than these side columns. And that might be the case, but most of the time you want, to have the columns have equal weight on the page. So this large gutter here sort of emphasizes this middle space when it's smaller than these 2 outside gutters. So a better way to create that is to make these. So a better way to create that is to make these margins much smaller, and we want, or sorry, these gutters. We want these gutters to be smaller than the margins typically. A modular grid is a grid with both columns and rows. So we're dividing the space both vertically and horizontally. So we have 1, 2, 3 columns and 1, 2, 3 rows. And then the gutters in this example are consistent, but sometimes you might see a smaller gutter between the rows and a larger gutter between the columns. But you can, do whatever looks better there. And then the hierarchical grid is the kind of the more complex grid where we're combining a few different layouts. So in this example, you can see this is kind of our header where we might have like our site logo and then like a menu here. But then that layout or that column is very different from what you see down here. Here we have a 1, 2, 3 column layout and then a 1, 2, 3, 4 column layout. But in this case, this middle column is actually the same size as these 2 columns down here. So a hierarchical grid kind of combines a few different grids with different ratios of columns and rows. Okay, so here's a few resources to learn more about grid design. So the history of grid design. There's a bunch of stuff that I talked about that comes out of this article. And you can see a few more examples as well. So that's a good one to check out. History of grid systems. This is actually from a former professor of mine. He talks a lot about the history and goes into a lot more depth in terms of the specifically the Swiss style of grid design. Grid types. Some more kind of examples. Most of the stuff we've talked about, but you can see there's a bit more detail in this article. And then choosing a grid. Okay, so how to choose a grid based on your content. So kind of going through the process of deciding what type of a grid you might want to use. So those are a few good articles to kind of reinforce some of the concepts, and especially when you're starting to do your homework, you might want to take a look at those to get some ideas for how you want to set up your grid for your website. Okay, so that is it for the grid systems overview. Now I'm going to move into doing a little demo using CSS Grid. So I'm going to set things up real quick just to get ready to kind of do some demonstration. So I'm going to open up the GitHub desktop app and switch over to MMP 350. Make sure to fetch any changes. At this point, we're probably all going to be working at home, so there probably won't be many changes to fetch. And so then I'm going to show this in the Finder. And so I'm working on a new project now. So the last project that we did was this profile project. And so we're going to add some layouts here. And so as usual, I'm going to duplicate this project and add more to it. So I'm going to just do either right click and duplicate, or I can go to File and duplicate, or I can hit Command, whoops, not Command S, Command D. And so I'm going to take this one and name it Layout. And then I'm going to open up my whole project in Sublime Text, which I can do either by dragging MMP 350 over to Sublime, or I can even go to my repository, and if it has detected which text editor you use, you might have this new option here to open in Sublime Text, so that way you don't have to go into the Finder. And so here we are in Sublime. I'm going to add a link to the new project. So this is my index page in the main MMP 350 folder, my landing page. I'm going to put a new list item, a new anchor tag, and I'm going to link to layout and just call this layout, and then close the anchor tag, close the list item. So now I have the link set up, I can go and run my Sublime server. So I'll go to Tools, Sublime Server, Start Sublime Server. If you don't have the Sublime Server set up, you can go check out the previous video that I did and look for that. I'm also going to upload, when I get a chance, a few videos just kind of going over some of the basics. So that'll be there to review that in a bit. So again, just go to Sublime Server, Start Sublime Server. That will start the local host. So then if I go back to the browser and I open a new tab, I can type in localhost, and this one is 8080 for Sublime Server. And so we'll see the Sublime Server MMP 350, and then there's my new link to the layout. So I'll click on that. And so again, there's no layout here, so that's what we're going to be adding today. We basically just have like our content and our area where we can write a new post, and then we have the user info section and the title section. So we're going to kind of look at different ways to place these elements into a layout. So I'm going to open up the Elements tab because that's what we're going to be using a lot of today. I'm going to increase the size on that a bit. And so here's our container. That's kind of like our, our format. And then inside here we have the title, the user info, the login, publish post, and our post. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sections which we need to incorporate into our layout. And of course we also have a couple other pages, like we now have this edit profile page. So we'll want to make sure to include the layout in those pages as well. So I'm going to go back home. I should actually add probably a link to the home page here, but I'll do that later. So that's our site as it stands right now. Let's get ready to add some layout. So I'll go into this CSS Grid section. And so I'm going to go over a few different things and do a couple different examples, and then I'll talk a little bit about the assignment. So these notes are based on some notes created by Professor Stein. So some of you guys may have had Professor Stein before. He made this very exhaustive notes on how the CSS Grid works. So I'm going to go over some basics that are applicable to our project, but if you want to go into more detail, this is a good place to take a look. He also has links to a couple good places on here. The MDN CSS Grid layout section. There's also a good one. I don't know if I linked to it here, but I can add a link in the video on CSS Tricks, CSS Grid. So they have a really good guide to how the grid works. So I'll include links to all of those in the video description. So let's go back to our notes. I'll have to update this. Okay, so we'll start by adding some columns, and we'll talk about a new unit that we can do with a CSS Grid, which is the FR, or fractional unit. So that's something that you guys probably haven't seen before. We're going to add that in now. So I'm just going to start my CSS is pretty simple. So I'm just going to add in my first layout, and then add in this is basically just the one rule I'm going to start with. So I'm going to close my landing page and go to layout, and then I'm going to open up style.css. So in style.css, I have my kind of font pairings up here. Then I have sort of my main base style sheets, and then I have the more kind of specific style sheets. So my layout is definitely one of my main style sheets. I might put it like up here, but sort of anywhere kind of in this area here. So I'm going to do @import css/layout, and I'll start with layout-1, because just like we did with our typography and our color assignment, we're going to do a few different versions of the grid. And so then I'm going to make a new file, Command-N, and save as css/layout-1.css. And so we're just going to start with our container. Okay, our container is this main div that has all of our content in it. And so I'm going to say hashtag or hash container, so ID container. And you'll see if I just say display grid, nothing's going to change. So the way we say that we want to create a grid is just by using this one CSS rule, display grid. And what that'll do is it will apply a grid to everything inside of it. So you can kind of see the CSS, the Chrome highlighting has changed a bit now, where we see these kind of like grid lines in the different areas. And so by saying that the container is a grid, it applies that rule to the main elements of the children. So the title will go in the grid, the user info will go in the grid, etc. But the things inside of it will just stay inside of these divs. So that's an important thing to remember, is that the grid only applies to the immediate child elements of whatever element you apply the grid that you write as the grid. So let's add in a rule real quick. We'll make some columns. So if I say grid, template columns, and I'm just going to do 2. So I'm going to say 1FR, 1FR. And so that's a basically really simple way to create a grid. So what FR means is fractional unit. And so what it'll do is it'll add up the number of units that we have. So in this case, we just have 2. And then it'll evenly split the space between those units. So if I say 1FR, 1FR, we're going to get a grid with basically half the width for 2 columns. So that's a 2-column layout where each column is an even width. And until we apply other rules, the grid is just going to kind of put each of these divs one after the other. So we're going to fix that in a bit, but for now it looks a little funky. So then if I change this 1 to a 2, what's going to happen is it's essentially going to say, if this is our web page, okay, so 1 plus 2 is 3. So that means it's going to divide the page into 3 parts. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we're going to have 3 columns, but the first column is just 1. So this will be the first column here. And the second column is 2. So that'll be the second column there. So that's the basic idea behind the fractional unit. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so now we see our first column is about 1/3 of the page, and our second column is about 2/3 of the page. And we can add as many of these fractional units as we want. If I want a 3-column layout, I can put another unit over there. Okay, so now we have 1, 2, 3 columns. Although our login we don't see, so it goes to publish post. And we could also do 1, 2, 2. Or we could do 2 and 2. Well, that wouldn't really be different from 1 and 1. But we can add as many of those as we want to. So let's start with a simple 2-column layout where we'll have a left column here. That's 2 fractional units. So that's 2/3 of the page. And then a right column, that's 1 fractional unit. And you can see that this layout doesn't look right because we have most of our content in this more narrow column. And so we're going to have to add some rules to move our content around. And this is actually kind of the coolest part about CSS Grid, is that if you've done grid design with CSS before, you probably had to use put your divs in a very specific order, and you had to name them things like header and sidebar and main and stuff like that. But by using the CSS Grid, we can actually remove that relationship between content and layout, where we can take the content, see we have IDs that describe the actual content rather than the position on the page, like title, user info, login, etc. And we can use those and put them anywhere on the page that we want to. So that's actually a much more sort of pure or nice way to design a page, is by separating completely the style from the content. So now our HTML really only talks about content, which is what it's supposed to be doing. And our CSS is handling all of the layout, all of the typography, all of the colors and stuff like that. So we really want to try to as much separate style from content as we can. So let's look at one more rule before we move on to setting our things, which is the gutter. So if I say grid gap, that's actually what sets the gutter. So if I say it's 1 EM, then we'll see a nice little gap in between our two columns, as well as our rows. So we can set a specific column and row gap, but we can also set both by just doing grid gap. And you can see that rule, whoops, here if I go to grid gap and I expand that rule, you can see that it's actually setting the row gap and the column gap. So it's really pretty simple to make a nice grid with CSS. We only have basically 3 rules so far, and then we'll kind of move these guys around a little bit. So let's place our different sections into different parts of our grid. And there's 2 basic ways to do this. One is using sort of the numbers to describe the grid, and then the other is using what's called grid area. I'm going to go over the number-based approach first, and then I'll go over the grid areas approach. So if I hover over my container, you can kind of see how CSS is dividing up the grid. And the way that we can approach this is we can basically think about this line here is like our left, and then in between, and then right. So for a 2-column grid, this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. And that's basically how we'll tell the different parts of our content where we want them to be. So let's move things around a little bit. I'm going to do a couple variations of this, but we'll start in the first version. I want to put my posts over here. Obviously that makes a lot more sense. I'm going to leave this section here. I'm going to move the title over here and then move this stuff down. So let's start with our title. We don't actually have to do it in order, but since the title is the first thing, we might as well do that. So I'm going to say ID title. And so there's a couple different ways to do this. One is I can say grid column start. So I can just set a specific number for where it starts. So I'm going to say 2. And the reason I'm saying 2 is because in our grid here, I want it to be between 2 and 3. So remember, it's 1, 2, 3. So there's 2 columns, 1, 2 columns, but there's actually 3 parts. There's the start to the column, the second part, and then the third part. So we want to go between 2 and 3. So we're going to say grid column start is 2, grid column dash end is 3. And so you'll see that moves the title over to this section of the grid where it starts at the number 2 over here and it goes over to number 3 here. And so now everything else in our grid has updated because we've kind of moved everything around a bit. But we want to keep going, so we're going to be very specific about where everything should be. So the user info is the next one, and I also want the user info to be actually kind of where the right post is, right there. So we're just going to use the same rule, 2 and 3, but I'm going to write it a slightly different way. So another way that I can write that rule, a sort of shorthand, if I say user-info, I can say grid column. And then instead of using start and end, I can just put the start, so 2, and then slash, and then the end, which is 3. So now our user info fits over there in the second column as well. So that's 2 different ways to do it. Grid column start, grid column end, and then start and end is one rule. We can see if we click on this and then look at the rule in the inspector. If I expand that, you can see it's actually doing grid column start 2, grid column end 3, but it's just a shortcut so we don't have to write as much text. So then for the login we can't see right now because we're logged out, but we can assume that we want that to be in the same place as the user info. So I'll just do the same thing here. If we log out, actually, we'll come back to this later, and I'll log out and see how it looks. But since the login and user info kind of replace each other when we're logged in or logged out, it's probably a good idea to have them in the same place in our layout. Okay, so let's move on to publish post. So publish post got pushed all the way down here because these things come before it. But with CSS Grid, we can move it wherever we want. So let's move it back up to the top right here. So I'm going to say publish post. So ID publish post is this guy right here. And so let's see if we can do this just with the grid column. We may need to add grid rows as well. So a third and final way to add our grid start and end is actually to do a slightly different variation of the 2/3. So this grid column starts at 1 over here. But then we actually want to cover the space of 2, or actually this is just 1 since we're doing 2FR1. So we just want to span 1 column with this guy. So instead of saying 1 to 2, I can say 1 span 1. So with that, instead of saying, start here and end here, I'm basically just saying start here and then go 1 column over. So if I said 1 span 2, I would go all the way across these 2 columns. So that's the third way to write it. So if I say 1 span 1, that's not going to change anything. We really need to move this guy up, so then we can set our grid row as well. So to move this guy up, let's say grid row is 1, and then we can say span 1. We might need to fix that later. Okay, so now we have our title, user info, we have our publish post section, and then we have our post section. And so let's take a look now that we've got most of the stuff laid out at how the row works. So right now you can see here that my publish post is 1 in the row, so 1 span 1. So it just takes up this area versus our 2 rows over here. So if I'm happy with the way this looks, I can just move this guy up and that would be fine. But if I want more space for this publish section, I could also move that guy down by spanning 2 rows. Okay, so I can go back and say span 2 instead of 1. And now that publish section will span 2 rows. So the content doesn't actually make up that much space, so maybe that's not going to work. So we could make it a little bigger if we wanted to, but we can leave it the way it is. The other thing that we can do, I can leave this as 1 span 1, and then we can move our posts section up. So I'll say ID posts, and I'll use the same grid column as publish post because they're in the same column. And then I'll set the grid row to just 1 below. So I'll say 1 span 1. So that's going to create a different issue, which we'll see in a second. Oh, whoops, we want to go 2 span 1. Okay, so if we do 2 span 1, then our posts will be kind of at the top here. So we have our publish post and our posts, and then we have our title, our user info, and our login. So one issue that you'll see here is that now this login or user info section actually takes up this whole area, which is okay. We don't see any problem with that right now. But what we would get a problem with that is if we added more rows in there. So a way that we can deal with that is by adding a row onto this post section. So now if we look at the publish post section, the user info section, now it just takes up the amount of space that it normally would with its content. And now that this is over here, I can get rid of this margin bottom. I don't need that anymore. So where was that? That's in main. Let me just get rid of that real quick. Okay, so now we've seen creating a layout with just the basic numbers for the columns and the rows. Now you can see that I didn't actually add the rows for my first three, the title, user info, and login, because they do sort of just go in the order of the HTML. And that's okay, I can leave it like that, but it's a little bit better to make sure that I actually specify where I want those to be. So my title is grid row 1 span 1, I'll put that up there, and my user info is grid row 2 span 1. So that way I can just be very specific about where I want these things to go. And I'll put that in the login as well. So that's one way of organizing the site. There's a lot of other ways that we could do this. For example, if I wanted to just have my post take up this entire left-hand column and move my publish section down here, I could do that. So I can just go to posts, say grid rows 1, so that'll move it up, and maybe I'll do span 3. And then I can go to publish post and just say, okay, the grid column is actually now 2 span 1, and the grid row is 1, 2, 3. And now they're in a different place. Okay, but now we also see the issue when we have an unbalanced column of a lot of content, our posts, versus less content over here. So again, we can just add a little bit to this section. So I'll say posts, let's say span 4. Maybe that'll fix it. Yeah, so that's really all we have to do is say post span 4. So now this fourth column all the way down here kind of matches the rest of this content. So here's 1 row, 2 row, 3 rows, and then the fourth row for both of these just keeps going down. So that is one of the restrictions with a layout, is that each column actually has to match. So the rows, the columns are going to be consistent as well as the rows. So you might like this layout, you might like the other layout. You guys can kind of play around with different stuff to see how you want it to look. And then you can kind of decide. So let's take a look and make sure it looks okay when I log out. It doesn't look great. We're going to actually, in a couple weeks, we're going to learn how to kind of lay these sections out, these smaller sections out a little better. The layout that we're looking at right now is really for like the whole website, like all these main pieces of content. In a couple weeks, we'll look at how do I lay out like this one section in here, which we're going to use another CSS concept called the flex box to do that. So even though this isn't perfect, I'm going to leave this like this for now and just focus on the main overall layout, which is looking pretty good. So this is one example. I'm going to make another page and do another example, this time using grid areas. So you guys, for your homework, you can do either one. If you prefer using the numbers and you think that's easier, that's great. Some people like to think that way. This new way of doing it is a little bit more sort of semantic. So we're going to use names for areas and just place things in the areas that way. So it's a little more abstract, but some people really prefer using this. So let's do an example of that, and then I think we'll be done. So I'm just going to go back to my style.css, and I'm going to change this to layout 2. So I'm going to do 2 examples. You guys are going to do 3 for your homework. So when I reload this, now we go back to the sort of non-layout or manuscript layout that we had before. So I'm going to add in layout 2 and then use what's called grid areas. So I'm going to make a new file, Command N, and save. And I'm already in the CSS folder, but I want to make sure I'm in layout. So I'm in layout, CSS, and I'm going to call this layout-2.css. And the beginning of this is going to look very much the same. I'm going to say container and display is grid, and then I still have to set the number of columns that I want. So for this one, let's do the other way around. Let's say grid template columns. Let's say 1 FR and then 2 FR. Okay, so now we have a small left-hand column and then a larger right-hand column. And so then the part that's going to be a little bit different, oh, let's also set the gutter. So I'll say grid gap. And I'll go with 1 EM again, pretty straightforward. If you want a larger gap, you could go with 2 EM. That's going to be pretty big. You could also go by pixels, so I could say like 20 pixels. Any of those units are fine for the grid gap. So actually, let's do 2 EM. It's kind of interesting. We can stick with that. And so then for this one, instead of saying what number of the column of the grid I want to do, what I'm actually going to do is define a few different grid areas, and then I'm going to place content into those. So what that might look like is I might say, you know, here is the title area, and here is the login area, and here is the publish area, and then here is the posts area. And basically the way that I do it is I just say how much I want each one to take up. So we're doing a really simple 2-column layout. It's not super complex, so it's pretty easy. But I'll try to show an example where it gets a little more complex after we get the first version done. And so the way that I do that is I say grid template dash areas. And this one is a little funny. Basically, I'm going to put this semicolon down here. And essentially, we go through row by row and then say what we want our columns to be. So remember, we have 1, 2 columns. So we just have to do 2 each time. But they go in quotation marks. So let's say we want to do the title and then the publish. And then on the next line, we want to do the login and then the posts. And then I think that's it. So then down here, what we want is sort of nothing. So I'm just going to put nothing here and then more posts. So that way the post can keep going down the page. So that's my grid template areas. I basically go 1, 2, 3 rows and then 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 columns. So it's pretty simple, but you can't make any errors. So for example, if I had this like that, where it didn't match the number of columns in the 3rd row, it would just break and you wouldn't see anything happening. So I have to be very careful to make sure that I'm consistent with the number of rows and columns. So once I decide what my areas are, I can just place things into those areas. So the title is really straightforward. I just say title, grid area is title. And for some reason, I don't know why they do it this way, but down here, I don't have to use quotation marks. Up here, I do have to use quotation marks. So the title is grid area title. That's going to stay the same, but we can see that that's working. So then the login and the user info, I'm going to put these together in this case. So I'm just going to say login, comma, user info. They're both in the grid area login. And then publish post is in the grid area publish. So even though my ID is publish post, these don't have to match. The ID can be whatever you want. These have to match. So the grid area just has to match your grid template area. And then the last one is my posts. So the grid area is posts. And there we go. So similar layout, but reverse. So I have the title, I have the user info and the login there, and then I have the publish post and the posts. So what would happen if I took out this nothing? It gets all screwed up. So we got to make sure we have that consistent. We can also see that like posts goes like this, and that works fine. But that has to be contiguous. So if I have like nothing, nothing here, that's going to create a problem. Okay, so our grid is all broken. So we don't want to do that. But you could have like the login section also span down here. That's fine for now. That might create an issue if you have more content over there. So we want to leave that as just nothing. So we can also like span things across. So let's say I wanted to put title here as well. Now our title will take up that whole area, but we don't have a place for the published post, so we'd have to move that somewhere else. So maybe we could put that here. So now our title takes up that whole section, even though the content doesn't actually fit there. Then we have the login, and then we have our posts. But of course that doesn't really work because we need some more space down here. So then we could say nothing posts. Okay, so now that looks better. Another thing we could do is we could stick our login area up here. So then I could just take login out of here, put it right there. But then instead of posts, maybe we would just have publish again. So we can kind of move stuff around really easily when we're using the grid template areas. I don't have to touch any of these rules anymore. I can just move stuff around up here. But it's a little more abstract, so it's a lot easier to create errors. But yeah, so those are kind of the basic 2 ways to create a CSS grid. There's a lot more complexity that goes into it. I just kind of want to introduce you guys to some of the basics. And so then for your homework, you can kind of explore this a bit. There's more info in the notes. So I go over using the repeat rule, which we probably don't really need because we're not going to be creating super complex layouts, but it could be useful. I also go over some of the other units like max content, and talk about the grid gap, grid areas. So there's a lot more stuff in the notes that you can take a look at. But those are kind of the basics to get you started. And then if you want to get into more detail, of course, there's the CSS tricks guide, and then Professor Stein's guide as well. So for the assignment, let's take a look at that real quick under week 7. So pretty much similar thing to what we've done in the past weeks with our CSS projects. You can create 3 different layouts, layout 1, 2, 3. You can choose by using either the columns and rows or the template areas, whichever you prefer. And then eventually we'll decide which one you like best, and we'll just save that as the main layout.css. So once you finish that, that will be due next week, I think next Wednesday. And we'll put those on a discussion board on Blackboard, and so you guys can give feedback. So for everybody's post, you can just add it on there, and then everyone can say something about which layout they prefer, and why they prefer it. And so just to go over that, the way that you will be able to look at your classmates' work is just by going into Chrome. And so if this is like, you link to one of your classmates' sites, you can open it in Chrome, open up the developer tools. So I did that by doing Command Option J on the Mac. On the PC, I think it's Control Shift K or J or something. But then you want to go to the Sources tab, which you guys have seen me use in class, and then just go to style.css. And all you have to do is just change this. So if I go to layout 1, you'll see layout 1. And if I go to layout 2, you'll see layout 2. So when we're giving feedback on Blackboard, you can look at your fellow classmates' work by switching between the layouts, and then just say which one you think is the strongest and give a reason why. So we'll see how that goes the first time, but that will be next week. So I'll go over those instructions again. So I think that's it for this video. If you guys have any questions or comments, please put them on the Blackboard discussion thread. If you have any other ideas but you don't know how to implement them, I can give you some code, or I can make another video. And I'm going to now just upload this stuff on GitHub. So I'm just going to say adds layout example. And then I'll just push to origin, and I'll include the links to the GitHub repo as well as GitHub pages in the YouTube description.